We can apply certain tests to worldviews, and our author here wants to suggest 4 different tests that we can use to evaluate and compare these different worldviews.
All right, so he's going to give us 4 tests here.
Yeah.
And so this is going to be the criteria that we can look at and say, okay, how do various worldviews stack up with regard to these tests, right? The first one he calls the consistency test, right? He says any worldview that involves inconsistent beliefs or assumptions cannot be true, or at least at those points anyway, because it is a basic rule of logic that no contradiction is true, right? So if I say there is a book on the desk and someone else says there is no book on the desk, well, those are contradictory claims, and both of them can't be true, right? And so he says very rarely will someone have a worldview that involves a explicit contradiction like that, right? No book, some book, right? In fact, he says he's never come across a worldview that says, for example, God both exists and God does not exist.
Right. Right. You know, we say things like, language doesn't exist. But then you go, okay, well, how do you know that? Yeah. So then I go in to explain it. By just the mere fact of doing that. I'm showing that I'm contradicting it, or I'm not able to live within that idea.
That's right.
And so I'm being inconsistent. I would fail the consistency test.
So language doesn't exist. Well, how do you say that?
Right. You just don't. Yeah. The tree falls in the forest and no one's around. And so that's type of things that we look at.
All right. So consistency, right?
So what's more common is that we encounter it here with the consistency test is that we encounter people with foundational convictions or assumptions that seem to be implicitly contradictory. And he gives an example here that he's met people that believe that there are no moral absolutes, no moral law that applies to everyone, but who also think there's this cosmic law of karma. You know, you get what you give. If you do bad things in the world, it's bound to bite you.
Right.
I don't really know if we see that. According to which we're rewarded for our good deeds and punished for our bad deeds, not in this life, then in the next. Okay, that might be something to look at. On the face of it, these beliefs are inconsistent, because if there's such this thing as karma, there must be an absolute moral law by which people's deeds can be judged good or bad. Right. A big rubber band in the sky that reflects back the negative attitude that you have towards people, and you've pushed somebody over on their bike, but then you slip on the ice. Right. There's your karma for you.
So this is what he calls an implicit inconsistency, right, or contradiction. You know, if indeed there is no moral law, right, so there's no way to judge people morally because there is no moral law, then how in the world do you determine what is good karma and what is bad karma, right? You're using some type of standard, the moral law, right, to determine good or bad in that instance, right? And so you're being implicitly contradictory in your statement, right? Kind of thing, yeah. The next one is the so what's the coherence test? Well, he says the word coherence literally means to stick together or to be united, right? Cohere, right? He says a worldview coheres if its parts hold together well and support one another. Right? So if a worldview includes beliefs and assumptions that appear to be unrelated to each other or in tension with each other, then the worldview lacks coherence. And conversely, if a worldview includes beliefs and assumptions that are closely intertwined, right, where some parts explain other parts, then that worldview has coherence. It fits together well, right?
And then our third one is the explanation test. A good worldview will help us explain the things we observe about ourselves and the world we inhabit. Sure. As it turns out, some worldviews can better explain things than other worldviews. As philosophers say, they have more explanatory power, which makes the explanation test a very valuable test of the worldview. So things like, it's within fire's nature to go up to the sky. Okay, well, like what part of their nature? How does if you burn paper, how does it know to go to the sky? Well, then you have the thing like gravity. Okay, gravity offers a better explanatory power of that. So it's within its nature, within the scope of a viewpoint of of gravitational fields.
Yeah. So notice if you say it's the nature of fire, then that's your explanation for why it's acting or behaving the way it is. And then you say, well, what do you mean by nature? And now you have to say, well, you mean it's fire.
Yeah.
And so
fire forms.
Yeah. And so now it's the nature of fire that causes it to act this way. Well, what do you mean by nature? Well, I mean that it has fireness. Right?
Right.
And so now you're in a circle, right? The nature causes it, and it's based on fireness. And so, yeah, that's a problem. Right.
So if a worldview can explain things and explain them well, that's a good indication that the worldview is true. So it offers a little bit more. We can test things for gravity. We can take it from the really big to the really small, and we don't just have to talk about the four elements. We actually expand more apart from that. So if one worldview can better explain things than another worldview, we have more reason to believe the first and the second. So we can do this with Christianity and atheism. Atheism can explain things, but Christianity seems to offer the better explanation, according to us.
Yeah. So that's the explanation test, right? Which one explains better, right? What our observations, our perceptions, that sort of thing. And then he says there's the evidence test. Right? So this one is kind of a tricky wicket, right?
Yeah.
Kind of sticky wicket type of thing, right? He says the basic idea here is that if a worldview is true, then it should fit with the evidence, right? All the evidence that we have available. Well, that seems to make sense, right? Does it fit with the evidence, right? The immediate evidence, for instance, of our senses, right? The evidence of reason, the evidence of our conscience, right? Or the evidence perhaps of history or science and so forth. So does this worldview fit with the evidence, right? He says in the broader sense, evidence, notice this, is anything that can serve as a truth indicator, anything that points towards the truthfulness of some belief or claim. So this is kind of interesting because most people just take evidence as, a fact. Right? A fact is evidence.
This is a thing. Respond to it.
Well, right, and a fact is just a thing, perhaps, right? Or it's and facts are not really evidence. You have to attach a fact to a particular truth claim for it to be considered either evidence for the truth claim or not, right? And so what he's suggesting here is that evidence, a fact, let's say, becomes evidence if it's more likely to indicate that a particular claim is true. If this fact is more likely to indicate that this claim is true, it becomes evidence for that claim. Right, that's what and so he says evidence is anything that can serve as a truth indicator to a particular claim. Right, it points towards the truthfulness of some belief or claim.
Right.
Yeah. So this is kind of interesting because an evidence is just not any fact that exists in the world. Right. Here's a book. There, that's evidence. Evidence of what? Well, you got to have what it's evidence of, right? Not just the fact, right?
Yeah, and we do this with murder cases. That we find a body in a building. Well, it's just a building, right?
Yeah.
Oh, but it's actually a drug den. Okay, well, that might add to the evidence that he was murdered for a reason, and so we might bring that into our evidence field and put that in our little notebook as an indicator.
Yeah. Truth indicator. Yeah.
The evidence we use in everyday situations is often observational in nature, based on sense perception. But it's important to recognize that direct sensory observations aren't the only kind of evidence.
All right, so there's more than one type of evidence, right?
Yeah.
I see it there. That's the evidence, okay? Well, there may be more than just, sensory perception as evidence, right?
This is something that a lot of people need to understand is that just providing, a finger of God sliced off. Here you go. This is evidence of God. Is not the only way to present evidence.
All right, so here it is. I write 2 + 2 = 5, and you say, what's the evidence that 2 + 2 = 5? Well, I can see it right there, so that's the evidence.
Right.
I see it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, really?
I sense it well. So our internal faculties of intuition, reason, and conscious and conscience can also serve as sources of evidence for certain truth claims.
Right. So it's unreasonable just because someone's written 2 + 2 = 5 to take that as evidence that 2 + 2 = 5. Right?
You can believe that that statement is 2 + 2 = 5, but that doesn't mean there's the equals is correct.
Yeah.
We rely on external sources of evidence too, such as testimony and of trustworthy people. Right. We do this for history as well. Unless if you see Abraham Lincoln with your own eyes, pictures can be faked, video can be fake. I don't care about his documents. I don't care what the scholars say. Okay, well then you're never going to believe Abraham Lincoln existed.
Yeah.
Okay, you're going to have a hard time with anything in history whatsoever.
And so the evidence test, he says, is important because a person's worldview can be confirmed by the evidence, or it can be disconfirmed by the evidence, right? He says, that said, this test can be tricky, as we mentioned, because no one interprets evidence in isolation from their worldview. Right. So, what becomes evidence to a certain extent is kind of determined by the worldview, right?
We saw this in Mish Sok's How to Be an Atheist book, where he talked about how scientists are really hard to get rid of their theories. And so it's not just, I come into conflict with this piece of evidence that seems to knock my theory out of the way. You don't just throw away your theory. You worked hard on it. There could be other explanations for it. Yeah. You could just...
So I need to dig a little deeper because I think my theory is right.
Right.
And so,
And sometimes that is the case. Sometimes there is, you're looking at the evidence wrong, or you haven't factored plus B into your equation. And so adding the plus B
That's right.
Makes your equation stronger. Yeah. And so then you have theory prime. So you're like, well, I was close, but, I really did most of the work there.
Right. So what he's getting at here is our worldviews do influence how we interpret any evidence that's presented to us. So we can't just point to the evidence, right? Or the facts to approve or disprove a particular worldview.
Right. So when presented with a piece of evidence, each of us will try to fit that evidence into our current worldview. But that evidence will fit better with some worldviews than with others.
All right. So now he's trying to help us to see that, how this can work, right?
Right.
This evidence can fit better with some worldviews than other worldviews, right? Okay.
One way to approach the evidence test is to consider what we expect to observe if a particular worldview were true. Let's assume for the sake of argument, worldview X is true. Would we see... that evidence could come about.
A, B, and C,
right?
We would expect A, B, and C if worldview X were true, right? So that's what we expect. So do we see that, right? If we don't, that may be an indicator that worldview X isn't true, right? It doesn't meet our expectations based on what the worldview should provide, right?
What would be surprising or unsurprising if that worldview were actually true?
Right, that kind of thing. So he tells us the 4 tests here that have been outlined aren't some esoteric philosophical principles, right? They're really just kind of common sense, kinds of things, right?
Yeah, this isn't something that, you need a deep philosophical sense. In fact, when you've come into conflict with these types of things, you probably went through this in your own mind. You probably didn't have steps 1 through 4, but that's how worldviews work and how you're evaluating different truth claims when you come into conflict or just into the space that you work in.
Yeah, and so these 4 tests. They're tests that philosophers use to evaluate worldviews, but notice there are also tests that scientists use, for instance, to evaluate theories.
Right.
And detectives use to evaluate hypotheses, right? And so, in fact, he says we apply these tests as a matter of routine without really being aware even that we're doing it. Right?